Okay, everybody, thanks for coming. We're going to get started and let people keep trickling in as they may. My name's Jacob Schlosser. I'm the president of the SLU Law chapter of the Federalist Society. I'm going to introduce the society and then our esteemed speaker, and then she'll get started. So without further ado, the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies is a group of conservatives and libertarians interested in the current state of the legal order and founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. To that effect, and also to talk a little bit about public policy, we have Ms. Becky Norton Dunlop, a prominent leader, strategist, and counselor in the conservative movement, who is the Heritage Foundation Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow. Her resume is very extensive, and we could go through the first 30 minutes of this event talking about all the things she's done. But relevant to this event, she oversees special projects, travels as an ambassador for Heritage, and works tirelessly to assure the legacy of principles, policies, and practices represented by the life and services of Ronald Reagan in the minds of Americans. She served in the Reagan administration from 1981 to 89 inside the White House, at the Justice Department, and most relevant to this conversation at the Interior Department, where she was from and then later in 94 to 98 as Secretary of Natural Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia in the cabinet of then Governor George Allen. Here's the Reagan administration facts. The Reagan administration as Deputy Undersecretary of the Interior, as Assistant to the Interior for Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So she has done a lot of work in this area, and we're excited to hear from her. So without further ado, Ms. Becky Norton Dunlop.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob. And you guys give me the high sign if anybody has trouble hearing. First of all, let me say I'm delighted to be with you on Zoom, although it would be much more fun to be with you in person. And perhaps one day very soon we'll be able to get together in person again with no masks and 3 feet social distancing or less. So anyhow, it's great to be with you. I do work for Heritage, as Jacob said. And before we get started on the topic for tonight, I wanted to mention to you that Heritage has produced a great book for law students. Not that you don't have enough books to go through anyway, but this book is called The Heritage Guide to the Constitution. I'm going to hold it up here. And it takes the Constitution and breaks it down clause by clause. And then we had a constitutional scholar write an essay on each clause. What did the founders intend when they wrote this? So particularly members of the Federalist Society who are interested in the original meaning of the Constitution and think of themselves perhaps as originalists now, it's a great resource. And you can go on Amazon and get this book, but if you get it through your Federalist Society chapter as a result of this meeting, I offer it to you for $10 and I'll pay the shipping. And that's a very good deal. Jacob can tell you, he said he has a copy on his bookshelf. And just run it through the Federalist Society, $10 each, and I'll ship it out to the law school and they can get it out to the various members. So that's my little offer of the day. Well, I'm delighted to talk to you about natural resource policy. You know, this has kind of been a policy area that's been the purview of the left for many years. They seem to have claimed it as their own, and their view was if the federal government's not doing it, then it can't be being done right. And conservatives don't really care about natural resources and environment. Well, I'm here to tell you it's just not the case. We as conservatives are interested in conserving what's beautiful, the good, the true, and the beautiful in many ways, in many areas, and particularly in our natural resources. And working during my time as Secretary of Natural Resources, and even before when I was at the Interior Department with President Reagan, we tried to think about how do we talk about natural resources policies from a principled perspective. You know, conservatives are ones that believe principles are important. We should base our lives, we should base our governance, we should base our policy views on principles, tried and true ideas that have stood the test of time and proven to be reliable and true. And so we've worked on this area of resource policy for many years now, and we've developed and published through Heritage what we call the American Conservation Ethic. And I wanted to talk to you about this tonight because it is increasingly an issue that conservatives, regardless of what work they're doing in their lives, have to deal with. We can see today from the Biden administration's policy pronouncements from the moment he was inaugurated as president, this is going to be a top priority for him. And he never talks about improving the quality and condition of the environment. He always talks about how we're going to regulate things. We're going to regulate things because we have this global warming crisis that's going to destroy the planet. And I'm here to tell you that we don't have a global warming crisis that's going to destroy the planet, but we do have a responsibility as citizens to be good stewards of our natural resources. So I'm going to go through the principles of the American Conservation Ethic with you tonight. Regardless of what profession you're thinking about going into, I think it's a good idea for you to think about principles with respect to all areas of life. And particularly while you're still studying, before you get into the workaday world and you have to deal with issues and problems coming at you like out of a fire hydrant, it's good to think about the policies that you believe in. What are the things that you believe and why do you believe them? And so tonight we're going to talk about natural resource policy. The first and probably most important principle for us to talk about is that people are our most important, valuable, and precious resource. I tell young people whenever I speak about this topic, if you don't agree with that principle, you probably won't agree with much else that I say. The elitist, the statist, the radical environmentalists, they all believe that people are a blight on the planet. And it would be better for the planet if we would just all get off. Well, that is, except them, because they say they tread more lightly on the planet. We don't believe that. Conservatives do not believe that. We love people. We think the reason we care about resources and the environment is because we want betterment for people. We want things to be better for human beings. So this first principle is very important, and there are lots of ways to think about it. Of course, the inherent value of every individual is greater than the inherent value of any natural resource. That's very important to think about. We think that environmental policy is only good if it's good for people. If people are going to benefit by the way we manage our natural resources, then we have good environmental policy. It's also true that it's human beings, their values and their intellect that come up with solutions to environmental problems. And of course, all environmental problems are not created by human beings, although sometimes the liberals would have us believe that. But it's human beings who, using their minds and the things that they have learned and their experience, as well as their study of science and things like that, that come up with solutions to environmental challenges that we face in our country. And so we should always look for ways to involve people in dealing with natural resource policy. When I was Secretary of Natural Resources in Virginia, for instance, instead of just having an Earth Day celebration, which is one day a year when we're supposed to worship the earth and occasionally clean up a stream side, we actually set aside a month in the spring. We called it Operation Spruce Up. And our goal was to connect the citizens of the Commonwealth, from the youngest to the oldest, with some aspect of the renewal of spring and fixing up our natural resources. So we had students going out and learning how to test water policy, water quality in rivers and streams near their schools and neighborhoods. We had civic organizations taking on cleanup projects, whether it was the local park, the neighborhood park down the street or the state park a few miles away. We had scout troops out cleaning up baseball fields and things like that. And the whole idea was to help people understand that we wanted to be good stewards of our natural resources. We wanted to clean things up after a rough winter in Virginia. We wanted to make our parks beautiful as the springtime came and life and plants and animals were coming to life in the spring. And then at the end of our month-long Operation Spruce Up, the governor sent people who registered and were involved a certificate that said, thank you for helping be a good steward of Virginia's natural resources. We got thousands and thousands of people involved in making this connection with their local natural resources who really had never done anything like this before, or certainly not been recognized for doing this. And then in the fall, we had another month that we set aside called the Fall River Renaissance. And this was our way of connecting citizens all across the Commonwealth to water quality. And we said, find a body of water, whether it's the James River or the Potomac River or the Rappahannock River or a stream or a little pond in your local community or a lake like Smith Mountain Lake, and take on a project to improve the water quality in this water body. The lesson here is that you as an individual can actually improve the quality and condition of natural resources. Something, again, that the left and the environmental radicals don't want you to think about. They love the idea of preservation, setting aside, locking up land and natural resources, while conservatives believe that we can improve the quality and condition of natural resources. And so getting people involved in this, people not only need to use natural resources to improve our lives, but we need to learn how to be good stewards of the resources with which we've been blessed. The second principle that's important to us, the American conservation ethic, is that renewable natural resources are resilient and dynamic and respond positively to wise management. Now, there's some predicates in here that you need to keep in mind. First of all, natural resources are resilient and dynamic. They are not static and diminishing. If you go visit a forest today and you go to visit that forest in the fall, it's going to be different. It's dynamic, it's changing, always changing, growing. Trees are growing, they're dying, they're changing. All resources, all natural resources are changing, and we need to keep that in mind. They're not static and diminishing, and they respond positively to wise management. And this is an important consideration. It's human beings who will provide that wise management. And what we need to do is make sure that human beings, the little ones who are just coming up, as well as adults, are actually learning good factual information, scientifically based information about our natural resources, because we can improve them in quality and condition, even as we're using them to improve life for mankind. We recognize that nature is able to carry a lot of negative impacts. It can recycle aspects of what affects it. It can recover when it's been damaged, and it can cleanse. Water is a wonderful cleanser, and as in anything, you can always take things to an extreme. But if you are a wise manager of natural resources, you can make sure that they continue to be beneficial for many years to come, and that you can actually improve them in quality and condition. There are many, many examples of this. I know some of you might be from Missouri, but many of you may be from other places in the country. There are examples wherever you're from and wherever you go that can point to this idea that our renewable natural resources are dynamic and resilient and respond to wise management. In Virginia, we have two huge examples that we always point to: the Potomac River, which was so polluted in the 1960s and so degraded in quality that it was very noticeable how bad it was. And people on both banks of the Potomac, as well as the federal government in Washington, D.C., took notice of this, and they took steps that improved it in quality and condition. And today people boat on the Potomac and swim in the Potomac, and there are fish in the Potomac. We still have some pollution problems with the Potomac. We actually see the Washington, D.C. government, which is overseen only by the national EPA, they actually dump sludge into the Potomac, directly into the Potomac River after they use chemicals to turn the water that they pull out of the Potomac. They clean it up to make it drinking water for the district, and then they dump the sludge into the Potomac north of DC. A terrible pollution problem, very harmful to the fish life there. And we've tried to get them to change and become better managers of the Potomac. They still like to do some of this under the cover of night, but this is government. This is government. Individuals and localities might be punished for this action, but because the federal EPA oversees the District of Columbia, they do get away with this. Having said that, as the water flows downstream, the sludge that they dump in north of the District of Columbia either sinks to the bottom or it gets dissipated. And so farther down the river, the Potomac again is in much better condition. The Chesapeake Bay, which is another huge water body that is in the Virginia watershed, is another body that we've seen harmed by natural occurrences, particularly hurricanes, but also has been overloaded with pollutants from farms in Pennsylvania and New York, Maryland, West Virginia, the District of Columbia, and citizens of the states, Virginia in particular, said we need to find out what the problems are, and then we need to educate the citizens upriver so that they will change their behavior and we can improve the quality and condition of the Chesapeake Bay. We've seen that occur since the time that I served as Secretary of Natural Resources, and it was measurable from the time we started in 1994 to the time we left office in 1998. There are other examples of this. I grew up in Ohio, for instance, and land that was strip mined in southern Ohio for coal, which left a kind of a moonscape landscape area for that time. Now, if you drove through southern Ohio, all you would see would be rolling hills, pasture land, no evidence of any strip mining. The land has been recovered and renewed, and it is now used for some other purpose than coal mining. Farmland, we can see oftentimes, if you know people in the farming community, you know how their processes have changed during the years to actually provide less inputs to the land, only what's necessary for a healthy crop, more cost effective for the farmer, but is very good at maintaining good soil quality. So these are all examples, and you can find many more in your own communities that demonstrate that renewable natural resources are dynamic and resilient and respond positively to wise management. So don't let people tell you things have to be locked up. The third principle is that private property protection and free markets provide the most promising new opportunities for environmental improvements. I mentioned some of the things that we were able to improve when it came to lands and rivers in Virginia. This is also the case with air quality. We have seen a tremendous change, particularly in the way automobile engines are run, so that they're much cleaner now. The best thing we can do for air quality that's impacted negatively by cars is to have a big turnover in the fleet. So if we have good jobs for people and we have a growing economy, they'll want to buy newer cars. Newer cars pollute less. It's better for our air quality. This is technology. This is the marketplace competing to come up with new solutions. The other thing to keep in mind is that ownership of private property inspires stewardship. People who own something tend to take much better care of it than people who are just borrowing or renting or passing through as transients. And so this is actually very good for natural resources as well. It's not only good for real property, real land, but it's also good for intellectual property. If people can keep and own what they've thought of and they've developed in their own mind in terms of new technologies and get paid for it, they're going to come up with new solutions, all kinds of solutions for challenges that we face in our lifetime, and particularly for challenges that we face with natural resources policies. And there's an abundance of examples to demonstrate this. I like one that I saw recently was a new skyscraper that was being built in New York City. And they had developed a covering for the windows, a glazing for the windows that actually ate ozone. And so here you have a skyscraper in New York City that's, seems to look like it's about 98% windows, and it's performing an environmental practice itself because somebody had come up with this idea to develop this kind of a window that actually improved the quality and condition of the air quality. So there are a number of examples, and you can look around and see these every day. And it's an idea that you need to focus on and think about. Protecting private property. I know this is something that lawyers think about often because it's part of our Constitution. But you have to think in how in so many ways, the protection of private property actually is beneficial to our environment and our natural resources. And then think about the marketplace. Whether you're going to go into corporate law or you're going to have a small legal practice in a town across this country, you might be thinking of ways that you can help entrepreneurs who are developing new ideas, protect those ideas, and have the rule of law enable them to be successful. And they may be coming up with new and developing new technologies or new ideas or new treatments for environmental challenges. All of this has to do with protecting private property and the marketplace. And we need to be constantly thinking of how to protect these important elements of the American life and the American system so that we have these tools available to us to improve the quality and condition of our environment and natural resources. The fourth principle, efforts to reduce, control, and remediate pollution should achieve real environmental benefits. You'll hear a lot of people talk about what they're going to do to improve the environment. And a lot of times it has to do with filing lawsuits. This does not improve the environment. On the other hand, if you're talking with people about improving the quality and condition of the environment, and they're complaining about a problem, you can actually find ways to go and work with people on the ground, community groups, local governments, local businesses, to help them identify the problem and come up with a solution. Lawsuits aren't always the answer, even if you're an attorney, but you can use the brains that you have and the knowledge of the law to actually make sure that the actions that are being taken show real, measurable improvements to the environment. The fifth principle is that as we accumulate scientific, technological, and artistic knowledge, we learn how to get more from less. We had a great leader in the free market environmental movement many years ago who actually talked about this principle as the learning curve is green. The more we learn, the more we know, the less negative impacts we have on our resources. And there are many, many, many examples of this as well. Efficiency is, of course, huge. We get more miles per gallon. Again, I talk about the newer model cars. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was the Secretary of Natural Resources, I my biggest problem for air pollution was Northern Virginia. And I actually had a free market scientist do a study. What can we do to encourage Northern Virginians to deal with this air pollution problem so we don't have more regulation? And now this was in the mid-90s, and his study came back to me and said, Secretary Dunlop, what we need to do is we need to encourage automobile developers and citizens to develop and want to own a hybrid vehicle. Nobody had ever heard of a hybrid vehicle in the mid-90s. And he was explaining to me in this research paper that he did that a hybrid vehicle that used a small gasoline engine that would power an electric motor would reduce the amount of air pollution that came from automobiles. And of course, what have we seen? We have seen particularly Toyota with the Prius and Honda develop the hybrid vehicle in the late 90s, came out much more actively in the early 2000s, a hybrid vehicle, which now is very popular, and other automobile makers have developed it. It was a way to allow the automobile, which we love because of the freedom that it gives us, to move to the next generation, where we would not rely completely on a battery-powered vehicle, but instead we would rely on a battery in a vehicle that was powered and got its power from a gasoline engine, which the fuel is available and efficient, available and cost effective. So this is the scientific mind is always thinking of what's the next generation. And that was a great development that we were able to encourage. No subsidies involved, just encourage the development of the marketplace for this new generation of car. Managing timber stands in Virginia. We have a lot of timber in Virginia. We have a lot of timber in the United States of America. And years ago, again, you would waste so much of a tree when you were cutting it and then processing it for lumber. You'd have a pile of sawdust going to off to waste, and you had a pile of bark going off to waste, and you had very thin pieces of wood that were being shaved off to turn these big trees into 2x4s or 2x6s. Much waste material in a lumber yard. Today, none of that is waste. The sawdust is now used in many new applications, one of which was developed by an entrepreneur here in Virginia, taking waste plastic bags from a grocery store and that sawdust, turning it into a slurry and running it through the machine that he'd invented, and out the other end comes what? Plastic lumber, which now you can buy at any Lowe's or Home Depot or hardware store. It was a great invention, and it eliminated that mountain of sawdust from having to go off to a landfill. On the other side of the yard, they had the bark pile. And now we have, if you go to a lumber store, you'll find that they have taken that bark and they have turned it into a substitute material, a substitute for plywood. They sell the plywood still, but now they also have these boards that are actually made out of chip wood, chip bark, glued together, excellent material for building. And the whole pile of bark isn't any more destined for the landfill. It's now being used in a new product. And same with the thin strips of wood that were being shaved off to make the 2x4s, the 2x6s, the big beams. Now they take those strips, they glue them together, and they end up with a decorative beam that costs more than you would actually pay for a 2x4 or a beam that was a single beam. All of this comes out of the mind of man. The learning curve is green. The more we learn, the more we allow people to use their minds and think of ways to come up with new ideas, the better it is for our resources and the less waste we have. And conservatives do not like waste. So those are just a few examples. One of the others I'll just mention real briefly is the idea of fiber optic cable. Before any of you were born, we were using copper wires, and now sand from beaches is taken and turned into fiber optic cable. And again, it's reduced the cost, the availability, the ubiquitousness of cable all across our country, which was obviously the next generation. And now we're going to wireless, and we know how much new technology has been developed to be able to go wireless. So these are just some ideas that demonstrate that the more we learn, as we accumulate knowledge, scientific, technological, and artistic, we get more from less. So the amount of raw materials we have to use is reduced, which is good for natural resources, and it's also good for the consumer, good for people. The sixth principle is that management of natural resources should be conducted on a site and situation specific basis. You know, the left, the elitists, the statists, they love to have big government. They want big central government based in Washington, D.C., and their goal is to control it. And too often they have, and they've put a lot of laws and regulations in place to make sure they still control it. Conservatives, when they get in office, try to roll this back and turn things back to the states and the Federalist mindset. But what we do know from a scientific standpoint is that environmental challenges are site and situation specific. What makes an environmental challenge in Virginia, particularly in Northern Virginia, is quite different from what might impact the natural resources in Southwest Virginia, where I am right now. What happens anywhere in Virginia is going to be quite different than what happens in Chicago, Illinois, or St. Louis, Missouri, or Los Angeles, California. So what the liberals and the statists want is to manage everything with a one-size-fits-all law or regulation from Washington, D.C., where they can actually pick winners and losers and who they're going to prosecute, and who they're going to leave alone. We conservatives, on the other hand, recognize the site and specific nature of natural resources and how they're affected. And that's where we would like to see any role that government has played out at the state level and at the local level. So we need to keep that in mind. It affects not only air quality, but water quality, the soil management. All of these elements of natural resource policy need to be handled on a site and situation specific basis. The seventh principle, I've got that note from you, Jacob. I'm trying to keep an eye on that clock, so thanks. The seventh principle is that science should be employed as one tool to guide public policy. You know, it is very important to understand what science is and what science is not. And science, real science, is when there is an assertion made and then it is tested. There's a hypothesis and it's tested. And you actually, scientists love to keep testing different hypotheses. They want to know, if you run an experiment, will you come up with the same result every time? At the end of the day, if you do come up with the same result of that experiment, you know you're onto something called truth. We engage people in public policy. We elect people, we appoint people in public policy, not to just be dictated to by scientists, but to listen to scientists and take into consideration many other elements. Who are the people that we are governing? What is their lifestyle? What is their economic situation? What are their values? All of these things come into play when you're thinking about public policy, be it national, state, or local. Science should be considered. It should never dictate public policy. We have seen recently where science has dictated public policy, not in the resource area, but in the healthcare area. And we have ended up with a very messed up circumstance in our country over this pandemic. Do you wear a mask? Don't you wear a mask? Well, the scientists one day are saying wear them. 2 weeks later, they're saying don't wear them. I mean, you have to take into consideration what the scientists are saying, but they are not the makers of public policy, and their voice should be one voice listened to. Their facts should be listened to, but many other things should be taken into consideration. Cost-benefit analysis is important. Ethics, as I said, are important. Science is never a consensus. You don't test hypothesis and then end up with a consensus. You end up with a fact, or you disprove the scientific hypothesis. So it's very important that we keep this in mind. Computer science is not real science. With computer science, you have somebody putting information into a computer, and then the computer does its work and spits out a response. But that response is based entirely on what another human being has put into the computer. Pseudoscience is something that's oftentimes used in the environmental area, and that's just an emotional circumstance of the moment. And the statists and the liberals and the environmental radicals love to use pseudoscience to frighten people into taking action. And there are, again, many examples of this throughout our history that we've seen. ALAR, if you looked up ALAR, you would find that that is one where people were frightened about this chemical that was sprayed on apple trees to make sure that the apples were beautiful and healthful. And they were frightened into not buying apples anymore. And pretty soon the people who produced the ALAR couldn't sell ALAR to apple orchard farmers, and many of the apple orchards in our country went bankrupt because of that. No scientific basis for what they were arguing. So that's important to keep this in mind. Science should be employed as one tool to guide public policy. And then the eighth principle is the most successful environmental policies emanate from liberty. You know, the most polluted spots in the world, even today, are in the old Soviet Union, where their constitution said it was unconstitutional to pollute, where the government controlled the permitting, they controlled the manufacturing, they controlled the inspecting. And what happened? Pollution occurred in many places. Here in the United States, in the atmosphere of liberty, not only do we find problems more quickly, but we have human beings who are coming up with solutions because they want to live in a world that has a healthy environment. So those are the 8 principles that I wanted to lay out for you. Keep in mind that if you abide by principles, you don't have to be emotionally fraught every time an issue comes along. You run those problems that you're dealing with through this screen of principles, and it will allow you to take a very principled position, whether it's public policy or in your own life. And that, I think, is an important message to keep in mind if you are a Federalist Society member and you're thinking of issues like this with an open mind and you care about liberty and the importance of people. So with that, Jacob, I'll turn it back to you and we can open it up for Q&A.
All right, thank you, Ms. Dunlop. A tour de force. I wanted to tell everyone that we're going to open up the chat feature. So if you want to ask questions there, you can. You can also use the raise hand function. I realized the last time I did one of these, that leaves out some of the people who have called in via phone. So if you have a question via phone, after a couple of questions, I'll open up the floor to you and just wait a bit to see if anyone that is called in via phone has a question. I wanted to start with, because we're the Federalist Society, because we are a bunch of lawyers, one of your quotes over the course of the talk stood out to me, and that was, lawsuits don't save the environment. And so what, as attorneys, can we do to encourage this sense of stewardship, or to basically to save the environment, if you want to use that phrase. But what do we do?
Well, I think first of all, it's very important that people be involved locally. So if you're a person who cares about the quality and condition of the environment, it's okay with us if you think globally, but you need to act locally. And so I always encourage people of all ages to get involved in local environmental matters. If there is a park in your community, or whether it's a public park or a private park, if there's a water body, take ownership, if you will, of it if it's not something that you own. On the other hand, if you do own property, be a good steward of that so that you can demonstrate to people that as a conservative, you're a good steward. Secondly, I would say, as you think about your careers, if you happen to go into, let's say, the corporate world, try to make sure that your company obviously is in compliance with laws and regulations that we have on the books now, but also to look for ways that they can be good stewards of the environment and good neighbors if they happen to be in a business that uses natural resources in any way to make a living, to make a profit. And make sure that you're, to the extent that you can, that your public affairs shop is, instead of focusing its resources and its support on these national environmental groups that simply want more laws and regulations, that you're focused on community efforts that actually do, in a site and situation specific way, improve the community where you live. So those are just a few ideas. Obviously, if you're going to get into running for office, getting involved in elected office, you need to look for ways that you don't pass laws that are more stringent than what we have on the books now, but you look for ways to encourage people to do what is right and to make a way so that entrepreneurs can use their intellect to come up with new solutions. Sometimes in public office, you can simply point out a problem and then people will come up with solutions on their own. But avoid trying to pass new laws and regulations to take away more of our freedoms.
Thank you for that. You talked a little bit about getting involved in politics. I want to transition now to a question from the chat asking specifically about Republicans, why Republicans haven't seemed to seize the environmental issue, and why have they let Democrats run away with it, especially with the youth?
Well, I think that's a great question, Tom. One of the things that my husband, who was also involved in natural resource policy, one of the things that we did about 20 years ago was we actually went to a conservative who ran candidate schools. And we said, we noticed your agenda of all the things that you teach on for candidates. And we think you should actually begin teaching on natural resource and environmental policy, because while it's not usually the winning issue, if you don't know what you're doing and you just ignore it, it can be the losing issue. And so we began to teach Republican candidates and conservative candidates, there could be Democrats there too, but conservative candidates, thinking about these from a principled standpoint and getting involved locally. I will say that when it comes to issue polling, the environment very, very seldom ranks above, let's say, number 10. And so what you find is that candidates focus on the 1, 2, 3, 4 top issues, and they never get down to number 10. But I strongly encourage conservatives to take up the mantle of thinking about being good stewards of the environment, learning about principles. Take these principles and make them your own. And I think if we had more conservatives and more Republicans who were thinking about this and talking about this in their communities, we would find that many, many, many more Americans agree with us than with this big command and control, one size fits all, do everything from Washington, D.C. view. So it's been a little bit discouraging, Tom, through the years to see that the Democrats have seized this mantle. And of course, they use fear mongering a lot. And when you frighten people, you tend to get them to, either back off if they have a different point of view, or just shrug their shoulders and say, well, we can't win this one. So we have to get Republicans and conservatives more involved in the issue, and we have to be willing to learn about some of these issues, like this global warming crisis thing. I mean, we do not have a global warming crisis, and we need to just be calm with people and say, global warming might be an issue. We know there's warming of the planet. It is not a crisis, and there are many, many more other issues that we should deal with, both from a financial standpoint and from the standpoint of helping people live longer, healthier lives. So thanks for your question.
Tom, thank you for the question, and Ms. Dunlop for the answer. I know I do have a couple of friends on this call, names I recognize, who I'm sure don't consider themselves conservative. I know there was a poll about July of last year that says about 34% of the country considers itself conservative. And you've kind of touched on this, but could you kind of state for me what the scope of conservative when it comes to conservation is? And is there a difference between your radicals, your liberals on this issue, and just kind of generally as you're making those classifications?
Yes, well, I would say that, conservatives do want to conserve what is the good, the true, and the beautiful. And of course, our natural resources are very often fit into the beautiful. And so we want to be mindful of that. But we also have to recognize that natural resources are useful for human beings, and they improve our lives. And we want to be able to use natural resources. So that's why we need to learn principles to be good stewards of those natural resources. We don't want to waste and be destructive, but we can find ways to not only use natural resources for the betterment of mankind, but actually to use our brains and our knowledge to improve the quality and condition of resources. And air quality in this country has improved through the years. Yes, there has been some government laws and regulations, but air quality actually began to improve in the most polluted parts of the country, New York and California, before there was a Clean Air Act passed by the Congress. People will take care of challenges in their local community. Sometimes they don't do it as fast as the people in Washington, D.C. would like them to, but conservatives, everyone likes to live in a community that's beautiful. We don't all have that luxury, but we can work in our communities to make it more healthy and to improve the locale in which we live so that it is a more lovely place to live.
Thank you for that answer. I'm going to combine two questions from the chat because they run very well into each other. One of them says that there's an appreciation for the free market private property position, but aren't, playing devil's advocate, aren't free market and private business also able to exploit the environment unless laws restrict them? And then also specifically looking at what conservatives or Republicans tend to get hit for, which is drilling and mining.
We don't want to imply or state that there's no role for government. Government was created by free people in the United States of America. We gave up some of our own personal power to create governments to protect our natural rights from being harmed by others. So we know that there's an appropriate role for government. We conservatives tend to really much more strongly support the idea of federalism, though, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, that if it's not a national issue, that it can be left to the states and to the people. And we think that there's much more opportunity for working with people to improve and manage the quality and condition of our environment on a state by state level, rather than having national laws that are so draconian and centralized. We do think that polluters should pay. For instance, if someone is engaged in activity that's a trespass and a harmful trespass against someone else, that's a problem. But the rule of law is in place so that you can take action in those particular areas. Part of the problem that we face in our country, I think, is we don't have very good education, K through 12, let alone beyond that, on good science when it comes to natural resources and how resources can be improved in quality and condition. Excuse me. And we also have not been true to the marketplace. We do have so much law on the books and so much regulation now that we don't really have a free market in place. So we have to look for ways to protect ownership, to allow markets to work as much as possible, and to keep that rule of law in place so that we're protecting the rights of an individual or a company or a community against harm from someone else. So I think that it's appropriate, but it does require some restraint by those who simply want to immediately jump into more laws and regulations.
Okay, I was on mute there. Yeah, you covered it. Thank you. Yes, I want to go, as we're talking about the private versus public policy, from the private chat back to the public chat. I think the last question posted in there says, do you see a role for policies that encourage consumer behavior changes as opposed to market regulations? And then separately, do you see the nonprofit sector as a major contributor to environmental well-being? And if so, what policies could help those sort of nonprofits flourish within the conservation movement?
Well, I do think that entrepreneurship is our greatest asset when coming up with new solutions, new technologies that actually improve the quality and condition of the environment. So anytime you're talking about public policies and law and regulation, what you don't want to do is punish the entrepreneurs. Tax policy is huge in this regard. Tax policy can punish entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs are the ones who are coming up with new ideas for dealing with environmental issues. Land ownership is important when it comes to good stewardship. The estate tax, for instance, is a terrible policy when it comes to good land management. The estate tax oftentimes causes large estates, like large timberland estates, and I say estate meaning large swath of land that's used for timber, to be broken up into small, which are not profitable, which causes the owner then to sell for development instead of managing for timber. So all of these kinds of policies, you have to think through them very carefully. How will they negatively impact people who want to do something that benefits mankind and natural resources? The entrepreneur that I mentioned earlier, who came up with the technology to take the waste bags from the grocery stores and turn them into the slurry with the sawdust and come up with plastic lumber, which has been great for building piers so they won't degrade, for building pathways for people who have disabilities and want to take a wheelchair into a walk in the woods, so to speak. When you're thinking about public policies and laws and regulations, you need to always think through, and this is a good time to have a discussion. Have discussions. How will this policy negatively impact people who want to come up with new ideas to improve our environment, or who want to come up with marketplace competition that will allow people to choose the good solutions or good outcomes that will be good for the environment? So it really requires people to think about unintended consequences of laws and regulations.
And what about the role of nonprofits and policy helping or hindering or not at all affecting the nonprofits that might work in this area?
Yeah, well, I think nonprofits that are actually engaged in on the ground activity to do something in a site and situation specific manner are very good. But I think, organizations that will argue to you that they're going to protect the rainforest, or they're going to protect the panda in China, or they're going to stop global warming if only you'll contribute $35. This is basically nonsense. And for every 100 environmental groups that are out there, most are small and they're locally focused. And then there are a few that pay big salaries and they have big headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they have very high paid lobbyists, and they're lobbying for subsidies, grants, subsidies in the way of grants, federal government grants, and laws and regulations. So I really encourage the nonprofit organizations to be small and focused on site and situation specific areas, and then you can make a huge difference. And if everybody did something locally, what do you think would happen globally? It would be good.
I want to focus next just for a short time on one of your principles that was talking about good science. And if you have any good science specifically on the use or disuse of oil pipelines or natural gas pipelines, for the purpose of talking maybe a little bit about the Biden administration's recent move to limit the use of XL.
Yes, excellent question. I think that anyone who thinks that the Keystone Pipeline, for instance, was a unique circumstance in our transport of oil world needs to Google the pipelines in the United States of America. You will find that it looks like a 1 pound package of spaghetti was dropped on the map of the United States. There are so many pipelines out there that transport oil and gas, LNG, lots of our resources. It reduces the likelihood of spills, accidents involving this material. It's much safer for the environment, and it can move much more product much more quickly. Energy is the lifeline and the motivational product for economic growth and development. Economic growth and development, economic wealth creates circumstances that allows us to be able to afford to solve essentially any environmental challenge that we face. So we should all be concerned about encouraging and supporting economic growth. And when we're thinking about that, we have to think about energy. Is it available? Is it accessible? Is it affordable? Is it secure? And the Keystone Pipeline is a perfect example of a circumstance that was going to allow us to have greater access to energy, which would be good for the people and good for the environment. It created excellent jobs. In most instances, it was crossing lands that were supported by the local community and by the states. And the beneficiary of not building the pipeline are people like Warren Buffett, who own trains. And trains have accidents. Tanker trucks have accidents. They have more accidents and spill more fuel than pipelines. So again, this is an instance where it was a fear-mongering circumstance to the Biden base to stop the Keystone Pipeline with zero consideration of the need for the energy product, for economic growth, for the workers in the community, for the states that were going to be impacted in their desire in this matter, and frankly, for the potential impact, and in this case, lack of impact, negative impact on the environment. a very bad policy decision.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to share that the last time I was at Heritage, I think you were involved in helping bring Alex Epstein to the building at Heritage to talk about his book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. So if anybody's more interested in that sort of economic argument, human flourishing argument for pipelines or oil in general over perhaps incentivizing more what's called renewable or green sources, I would suggest maybe looking into that. I think lastly, we've covered the liberal side, the conservative side. We talked a little bit about nonprofits. How do you compare the position that you've given through the 8 principles to what might be the libertarian view on the environment?
I don't know that there'd be much daylight at all between the position that I've laid out here in the libertarian, the pure libertarian viewpoint. Maybe we have a libertarian on the call here who could weigh in, but I think that they would be in agreement with these 8 principles. Actually, to be perfectly honest, there are liberals who are true liberals who would be in complete agreement with the principles. We might have some disagreement on the implementation, but it actually is the statist, the elitist, and the radical environmentalists who start off saying, no, people are a blight on the planet, and they end up with, actually, socialism is better than liberty.
All right. Thank you for that. I realize we're bumping up on an hour, so if anyone needs to go, thank you for coming. I realize I promised to open the line up to the phones, and then I didn't. So if anybody on the phone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, you can do that now. I'm never quite sure. It's like campaigning. I'm never quite sure when to walk away from the door. Okay, so it looks like we've gotten our questions from the chat and from everyone else on the call. Ms. Dunlop, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. If you have any questions for Ms. Dunlop, her email address is on the Heritage site, or you can email me and I'll talk to her about your questions. Don't forget also that she offered up a special discount. It's about, I'm seeing it's about an 80% discount on the Heritage Guide to the Constitution. So if you're interested in seeing that and using that as a resource, you can reach out to me at jacob.schlosser@slu.edu or the Federalist Society at slu.edu. In either one of those, I can compile that list and get that to her, and we can get those copies mailed out. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much again, Ms. Dunlop, for sharing your expertise with us. Have a great day, everybody.
It's been a delight. Thank you all very much for listening. Have a great evening.